All right, I am Chaplain Brian Koyn, and I'm interviewing Chaplain Colonel Charles Lynde. Sir, could you just spell your name for the record and then tell your position, your current position?
Sure. First name Charles, Charlie Hotel, Alpha Romeo, Lima Echo Sierra. Last name Lynde, Lima Yankee November Delta Echo. And I'm the command chaplain for the 9th Mission Support Command, whose mission is to, in part, to oversee Army Reserve equities here in the PACOM area.
Okay, sir. We appreciate you coming in and sitting down to talk. We'll just get started. We'll start from the beginning. So you just tell a little bit about where you're from and growing up and
Sure.
family.
Sure. I was born into a family that my father was active Army. He served 20 years, not as a chaplain, born at Fort Lee, Virginia, and so I grew up moving around every couple of years as an Army kid until my father retired, and we settled sort of in the Illinois, Chicago area. Chapel has been a big part of my growing up years, in part because of that. I have memories of my mother leading children's choir or playing piano in chapel services. I have memories of conversations with chaplains as a kid, getting a little Gideon's Bible in the pew rack on the way out of a World War II era cantonment chapel, Christmas Eve candlelight services and things like that. Couple of the most significant activities of my life, or events of my life, took place in chapels, Army chapels. That was where, whispering in a pew to my mother, I made my first profession of faith in Christ as my Savior, as a third grader. And then years later, my wife and I got married in a chapel at then Fort McClellan, Alabama. The chaplain's a big part of growing up.
So what was your, growing up in the Army, what were your thoughts on the Army? Obviously you ended up in the Army, but what were your thoughts growing up as a view of the institution and the lifestyle?
As a kid, you don't think of it too much. I just knew we moved around, and many young boys enjoy Army-ish stuff, so I would enjoy going and visiting my father's workplace, especially if there were, tanks or whatever located there, and seeing those displays. Never lived on post. Didn't really even hear the phrase military brat until my dad was retired, so in one sense it wasn't so aware, but it was how God provided for our family, was through my father's military service, and it was fine.
So how old were you when you settled in?
Started high school in Crystal Lake, Illinois, and my father started working in the accounting department at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago.
And then at some point you ended up in the Army.
Yes. When I was in high school, my junior year, I attended the awards ceremony at the end of the year, where different students who are graduating and getting scholarships, and as I was sitting there kind of listening to what the awards were, the best deal was the ROTC scholarship. Tuition, books, and fees, and a monthly stipend, that couldn't be beat. So I'm thinking, well, how am I paying for college? I didn't have too much of a plan. So my senior year in high school, applied for an Army ROTC scholarship, was awarded one, and not really sensing any great call to serve my country. It was just a way to pay for school at the time. But I was comfortable with the Army, having grown up kind of in the Army family overall, and started attending Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and majoring in chemistry.
Okay, majoring in chemistry. And at this point, the chaplaincy wasn't even, was it on the radar?
Looking back, I can see how God was preparing me. One evidence of that was just a great delight I had in studying the Bible, studying theology, and had enough classes at Wheaton in those subjects where, I'd say a good number of my electives were in those. Ministry or teaching were affirmed by different people in my home church. But no, not particularly sensing that chaplaincy where I was headed. No, that happened later on.
Okay. Well, tell me, you were a chemical officer?
That good connection there.
Okay.
Good connection. The Army thinks that way. He's a chemistry major. Let's put him in the Army Chemical Corps. Yeah, that was my initial branch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experiences as a line officer.
Well, I like to say it prepared me well to be a staff officer working on a battalion, dealing with a field that a lot of people don't want to have anything to do with. And a lot of people don't want to think about working in a nuclear, biological, chemical environment. A lot of people don't want to have anything to do with religion or chaplains necessarily. And so I gained some staff skills, and it was helpful that way. I got to know the Army from the inside more than as a child, as an officer, and operations and planning and staff sections and all those kinds of things and what they do. That was good preparation for being a chaplain. Many times when I was serving, I would be the only one of my branch, and the chaplain would be the only one of his branch, and we would hang out together. I was oftentimes at the battalion level one of the most faithful chapel attendees, even singing in the chapel choir or what have you.
Okay, and you towards the end of the Cold War in the Fulda Gap, is that?
Yes. My second assignment as a chemical officer was in Fulda, Germany, with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. Yes, thinking about the Soviets coming across the border there and what were we going to do. While I was there, the wall came down in November of '89. Yeah, it's just an interesting little footnote. My father's second unit of assignment, he was a chemical officer also, was the same unit, 1st Squadron, 11th ACR. At the time, they were along the Czech border, and he was sent over there because the wall went up. And while I was there, it came down.
Neat.
So.
Neat bookends there. And during that time, you deployed to Saudi Arabia as part of Desert Storm?
Yes, because I say it's the exhaust fumes of Desert Storm.
Okay.
The 11th ACR was sent down to Kuwait after the ground war was over, just in case Saddam got some kind of second thoughts of trying it again after everybody had left.
Okay. Anything that stuck with you during that time? Lessons learned, or just
from the deployment?
Yes.
Just the potential randomness of things. We lost quite a number of tanks and other artillery vehicles in a fire that started out in one of the artillery ammunition carriers. And I don't know if it's true or not, but the joke was we lost more vehicles in that fire than we lost in the war. And yet no lives were lost until the cleanup. And with all those explosives going on, mines deploying, and yet nobody was killed. And yet, during the cleanup, there were just the apparent, at least, randomness of these things. Yeah, there is a. I'm a firm believer that God is very much in control, but from our human perspective, things can seem very random.
Okay. So at some point here, you transitioned out of active Army?
Yes. With the drawdown of the early 90s, there were lieutenant retention boards going on at the time, which looked at your records to see if you even stood a chance of getting promoted to captain. And if you didn't make the retention board, you'd get a pink slip, basically. Call into your commander's office and told you in 90 days you had to leave the Army. So I was caught up in that in 92. That was a little bit of a mercy of God. Some of my experiences there in Fulda as a young lieutenant, I had a company commander when I was a platoon leader / XO who was very difficult to work for. God used that in my life to kind of humble me in part and to teach me to appreciate the submission to God-ordained authorities. And it wasn't easy. I got some awful OERs. I've shown them to a few HR folks, and they've never seen anything so bad. But the mercy in that was that when it came around for these retention boards, I knew there was absolutely no way I was going to get retained. So I could start preparing ahead of time. So one of the things I did while I was in Kuwait was I started my Greek for seminary ahead of time, and anticipating getting out and going to seminary. I had mentioned earlier that chaplains were some of my closest friends while in the Army, and some of the experiences I had in my first assignment in Korea, and then observing some of the lieutenants there, and then also just personally in Fulda, Germany, gave me an appreciation more on the inside of what chaplains could do, maybe being a moral authority or providing comfort or bringing God into the situation. And so I was attracted to that as I was seeing it more closely. And so not even really thinking about it so much, just knowing that I was going to be getting out, applied to seminary. And in God's providence, I was notified of my impending release from active duty on a Friday. And then the next business day in the mail, I got my acceptance letter to seminary. So the one door closed and the other one opened.
Nice. And at that point, were you thinking the chaplaincy or just ministry in general?
Two options were in my mind, either going into missions, maybe doing translation work, or chaplaincy. Okay. God had a pause in doing either of those after graduating from seminary. My home church back in Crystal Lake, Illinois, called me to be one of the associate pastors there, and so I did that for about 7 years before returning to active duty as a chaplain.
Okay. How did that time, in retrospect, how did it shape you, form you, and as you came back in the chaplaincy?
When I left active duty and went back to my home church, my second week there, a gentleman who I knew came up to me, Dick Burkhalter, and asked me when I was going to come to his National Guard unit and interview for a position. I didn't know he was in the National Guard, but I said, well, sir, I guess I'll come soon. So I did, and was accepted as it was a chemical brigade, and back then independent brigades had brigadier generals as commanders, and so I was given the job as the general's aide, and that was very helpful. Just a gift from God to kind of smooth over some of the maybe doubts or pains from the active duty time. The General Vander Kolk and I got along very well. I had just come off of 4 years as a chemical officer in active duty, and this was a National Guard unit, so they had recently become a chemical brigade, so nobody had a lot of experience. In fact, the general had grown up an artilleryman, so I was his chief advisor on chemical operations.
Wow.
We would go visit a unit and walk around together, and then we'd walk off, spend a few minutes. He'd ask me what I think, and then he'd turn around and come back in and tell the commander what he ought to do. It was very affirming for me, and that was nice coming off the painful time of regular Army. I was able to serve. This was while in seminary. I didn't become a chaplain candidate until the very end. God just opened some other doors. So this aide position, served as a battalion S1 for just a few months, but enough time to be the battalion S1 when the battalion was deployed to the Mississippi River flood of '93. And the manpower issues there were engaging. And then chemical company commander in the National Guard for about 18 months before, as I was approaching the end of seminary, shifted over to the chaplain candidate program. And it was nice to have National Guard chaplains to work with and to see how they do ministry. One kind of funny story, since we're sharing stories here. When I was the battalion S1, there was a battalion chaplain. I can't remember his last name, but he was Lutheran, and his first name was John. And I remember we went to AT that summer, and I took his Humvee. I was authorized a trailer, but no way of getting around, and I wasn't even thinking about it at the time, what I was doing, but he had a Humvee, and I just took it and used it for the S1 section. And then at the time, I was a first lieutenant and he was a captain, and somehow I did that. I don't know how that happened. It was a long time ago, but it's just not supposed. Every chaplain wants their Humvee, and somehow this battalion S1 took it. Fast forward about maybe 10 years later, and John is still a captain, but he's in the regular Army, just because of when you transition from the one to the other, your data rank is set back, and so you spend a long time as a captain if you do that. But I'd stayed in the reserve components and shifted over to the Army Reserve by then, AGR program, and my unit of assignment was here in Hawaii, and he was over here in Hawaii as a battalion chaplain. And so this guy who had stolen his Humvee now shows up as a chaplain, but senior in rank to him, and we had a good laugh about it. But yeah, that was that. I was able to see some poor examples of chaplains too, both in the Guard and in the regular Army, that kind of said, I don't want to do that. One chaplain, swore to make a sailor blush. I mean, he had not always been a chaplain, but it was difficult to see that being respected. It wasn't respected. Knew some chaplains who had weight issues. They would kind of have this belly, and they weren't respected for that. Another chaplain during a field exercise, grabbed an M16 and started going after the OP4, and the OC, senior OC came in and just chewed him up for that. So I saw some bad examples that I think helped guide me in how I might want to be a chaplain.
Yeah. So during these years as a National Guard chaplain,
Mm-hmm.
You were pastoring as well at the same
Yes.
time? And
Yes.
so how'd you find the interplay between the
Civilian and
the
military.
civilian and military?
Well, my time in the National Guard was mostly before 9/11. There was 9/11 happened just about 10 months before I returned to active duty in the Army Reserve AGR program. So most of that time was, kind of relaxed. You didn't have quite as much tension. God provided some elders in the church who were retired Army, and so they were sympathetic and could explain to others kind of what the nature of my ministry was. I sought to integrate them as much as possible. On a drill weekend, I would talk to soldiers and hear some issues, and then the next time I was maybe leading the pastoral prayer, I would incorporate some of those prayer request issues into my prayer in front of the congregation, so they could reminder, I'm a chaplain, and part of the church's outreach, if you will, is me serving this National Guard unit. The children's ministries love to have this soldier come in, uniform with Kevlar and everything, to talk about being a soldier and soldiering for God and things like that. And then on our annual missions emphasis week, I would set up an Army chaplain booth along with other church-supported missionaries, again to communicate that this is something that the church is doing as an outreach into the broader community. I would sometimes counsel soldiers in my church office, just because their availability and my availability just worked well.
Right.
So it was a good fit.
Not confined to the weekends and annual training then?
Oh, no. Soldier issues come up at other times. Had some good experiences though on annual training too. Some little lessons learned. Annual training was where I really made my deeper relationships, because you're with the folks for 2 weeks, and then over the course of the next year's drill weekends, you would kind of capitalize on those. There were people you knew, you could catch up on stories and things like that, and then by the time the next DKT came around, things had gotten kind of cool, but there could be a new resurgence of relationships based on that time. I remember walking around in the woods in Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, going from company location to company location. Oh, it was battery, it was an ADA battalion most of the time. And talking with soldiers. And, in '95, there was a heat wave in Chicago, which resulted in several hundred people dying. And this was right before our AT one year, and we had some soldiers not show up, and the temptation was to, AWOL and get them out of the Army National Guard. But I don't remember whose idea it was, but I called him up. And the one that I was able to get through to, his grandmother had just died in the heat wave, and he was with his family, and there were funeral services planned. So after those were over, he joined the battalion. But it was nice to see the chaplain as somebody who could help not just take care of a soldier, but also help with unit readiness. Because that soldier's trained and capable to serve, and yeah, that kind of stuff. Good experience.
So what transpired to bring you into the AGR program?
Oh yes. After again about 7 years, after about 6 years at the Evangelical Free Church of Crystal Lake, the senior pastor, Bob Page, came to my office and in kind of a congenial mentoring way suggested, hey, you've been an associate pastor for 6 years, maybe it's time in the career progression of pastors to, take a solo pastorate somewhere. One of the other associates was in the process of doing so, and he'd gotten there about the time I had, so he was just thinking, it's maybe time to move on. And as I thought about that, I was like, well, I could do that, but every year I go to annual training, I always come back and I just want to do this full time. But every year I bring it up to my wife, she's like, I'm not ready to go yet. And that was understandable. She hadn't grown up in that town, but had at that point in time spent a good chunk of her life there, and was very close to my parents. In fact, we bought the house next door to my parents. So the way God used all this was to use the pastoral time to give me some additional experience, weddings, funerals, baptisms, just more extensive grounding in my own faith and theology, and rootedness in what, with my endorser and all that kind of stuff. I've seen chaplains who lack that grounding, and they struggle. They struggle sometimes. So the senior pastor was recommending maybe time to look on for something else. And I went home that day, lived 3 miles from church, would go home for lunch. I went home for lunch and was talking over lunch with Andrea about returning full-time as a chaplain. And I remember standing at the door of the house as I was about to leave, and she said, I'll go. That would have been a very difficult for her to say. So it was significant. So I got back to the office and called the chaplain recruiter. And his name was Steve Langhow, and he told me I had recently been promoted to major. He said, well, the active component is not taking majors anymore, right, at this point in time. But have you considered the Army Reserve AGR program? Junior major is kind of the entry level for that. And I had heard Doug Lee, who was a senior AGR chaplain at the time, at a cast event talking about the Army Reserve only needing AGRs. And so I'd heard about it, and I thought, well, if that's the way in, then that's what I'll do. So I applied for the Army Reserve AGR program, and to make a long story short, about a year later, found myself here in Hawaii for my first assignment.
In the same unit you're in now?
Yes. I was the first AGR chaplain in the 9th MSC back in 2002. The only full-time person in the section. Now we have 3 AGRs and a contractor. So the mission ministry has grown. Yeah.
So how would you, as you think about your position in the AGR, how have you seen it's different or similar to those just on active duty?
Mm-hmm.
And also where you came from, obviously, in National Guard and
Sure.
other compos.
AGRs exist to facilitate the work of the traditional reserve soldier, the TPU, Troop Program Unit, as they're sometimes abbreviated. Your traditional reserve soldier is the backbone of the Army Reserve. About 11% of the Army Reserve is AGR. So we're not, our primary ministry is facilitating the ministry of others. And that does happen in the regular Army as you go up in rank. But when you start in AGR, that's your primary reason for being there. We do PCS around a fair bit. We don't have all the advanced civilian schooling opportunities that active component has. But we've got the same pay and benefits, and we wear the same uniform with U.S. Army on it. So to me, it's the best of both worlds. Yeah, it tends to be more administrative work. We always look for that balance. Everybody's looking for the balance of staff officer and pastoral skills. But in the AGR field, it's especially important because you're often the only one in a command of thousands who are doing that job full time. So there's no one to lean on except you. So if you don't have the skills, then the unit's hurting.
You find yourself better suited because of your previous assignments as a chemical officer?
Yes, that's certainly the staff skills that's been helpful there, and the 10 years in the Illinois Army National Guard. Now the Guard and Reserves are different, but there's still that sort of civilian-military balance, and that experience has helped me understand the traditional reserve chaplain and some of the things they're up against. It's changed a lot though since 9/11. The reserves and the Guard have been called on quite a bit in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so the nature of that balance has changed. More and more reserve component chaplains are not pastors in a church. They are teachers or hospital or hospice chaplains if they're doing some kind of ministry. I've known reserve chaplains who are insurance salesmen or salesmen of other things, police officers. So the classic, using those civilian skills, pastoral skills, and getting strong in those isn't necessarily as much the case these days.
And that's because people aren't willing to put up with maybe being gone a year here or there. Is that largely it?
It's a combination of things. I don't have any studies. I only have stories. But sometimes it's more the chaplain than the congregation. Sometimes it's the congregation, but many times it's the chaplain coming back. For example, I know a chaplain who came back from Iraq, and to him now, petty issues in the local church were hard for him to tolerate. So he just took a break. He was married, his wife was employed, so he just did something completely, took a break until he was ready to start pastoring again, and got another call to a church somewhere else. So he resigned, even though the church was willing to take him back, because he just didn't like the apparent pettiness of issues. Another chaplain, the church was willing to bring in interims and pulpit supply folks every few years when the chaplain was gone, but his own convictions were they needed ongoing shepherding, not come back every few years and do it again. So he resigned. Now there may be other stories out there where a church has pressured somebody. I remember talking with a non-chaplain general officer recently, and he was surprised to learn that pastors and churches weren't covered by USERRA laws. I said, well, they're oftentimes self-employed, and I don't think the federal government's going to tell a church they have to hire somebody back if they aren't a self-employed person. So that complicates things as well. Okay. I think that's one reason why more traditional employers, a hospital, a school, or what have you, are attractive.
Now, while you've been in AGR, you've deployed to Iraq?
I did. It's very hard for AGRs to deploy, but the opportunity came up while I was stationed at the Chaplain Center in school to deploy to Iraq in 09 to 010.
Mm-hmm. What was your role there?
There was a command, Minsticky, Multinational Security and Transition Command, Iraq, and I was the chaplain for Minsticky. So we were in the IZ, the International Zone, sometimes called Green Zone. And the unit's mission was to interface with Department of Ministry and Department of Interior, which oversaw the police forces, and kind of at that strategic, a little bit operational level, try to influence the Iraqis as they were rebuilding and shaping their security forces. So most of my duties were just direct pastoral care. We had some detachments in outlying areas, so I'd go visit them as I could. Did get some opportunities to meet with Ministry of Defense leaders and discuss Iraqi Army chaplaincy, or lack thereof, and why that was, and strengths and weaknesses of not having a chaplaincy, and what they might do in the future. So that was interesting.
Okay, but largely it was religious support to U.S. personnel.
Yes, and some Brits in the unit as well, and there was a NATO unit that was kind of a sister unit, and so there were some opportunities to minister with them as well.
Any particular noteworthy or significant for you events during the deployment?
Well. The initial deployment, I was supposed to only be there for 4 months, filling an underlap, and I managed to work my orders so that I was going to be there for 6 months. I felt I could get away with that. I couldn't swing a whole year. That would be too obvious. But 6 months, nobody would necessarily notice, versus 4. So getting there was difficult. I was a TRADOC asset, and I was an AGR. So TRADOC doesn't typically deploy its own people. I was on a TRADOC installation, Fort Jackson. They're not used to deploying their own. So it was down to the wire. I might not have even have gone. Finally, somebody said, yes, we'll cut the orders. And they called me and asked me what I needed to have in them. And I said, it needs to be for 6 months. So, yeah, so getting there was in and of itself a highlight. While there, because Minsticky was right under MNFI, later on USFI, and I was in the IZ, I had the opportunity to sit in on some of the religious leader engagements that they were doing and observe those and learn from them, and try to apply some of those things to the engagements I had in the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior. Yeah.
Those, what were the kind of content of those engagements? I mean, who were they with, and what were...
They were mostly with non-Muslim religious leaders, just hearing how things were going for their demographics.
Okay.
And then they would brief, at the time, I think it was General Odierno, on those. Sometimes they were political leaders. That was mostly what they were, just kind of hearing the woes of non-Muslim faith groups in Iraq.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as I guess when you look back at your, at least from the time you came on the AGR program,
Mm-hmm.
any highlights of either assignments or
Mm-hmm.
experiences in there that really stand out as being noteworthy for you personally?
Well, you asked that question. I can think of a couple different things. When I was stationed at the U.S. Army Chaplain Center in school, the deputy commandant at the time, Chris Wisdom, pulled me into the command team more so to oversee some of the civilian staff sections and kind of relieve him of some of that. That was a unique opportunity. Chaplains don't supervise civilians very often, but I had 5 that I sort of supervised. I mean, they'd been there so long, and they could manage. They knew what they needed to do. But when it came to evaluations or funding questions, or most often it was conveying bad news, you know, I could be counted on to do that tactfully or what have you. Yeah, so that was a treat working with, you know, the museum team, you know, Paul Villano, John Brinsfield, you know, these names from that era. I got to supervise them I worked with them very closely, so to speak, but it was just kind of a treat to have to do so in that context, and whether, you know, ensuring they had resources or what have you. That was nice. An interesting, my second assignment at the U.S. Army Reserve Command Chaplain's Office, I was the deputy command chaplain there. And then the office had moved to Fort Bragg in 2011. And there were 2 things there. One highlight, just that was great pleasure, was AGR chaplains, when they're not on reserve installations, don't have chapel responsibility, because we're providing chapel services for our reserve units. And so we're focused on that, and the active component manages the chapels. But I volunteered at Fort Bragg to pastor one of the congregations there, and that was just a sweet time. Worked with some active component chaplains, and just pastoring that little congregation. That was nice, and my family was involved in that, and it gave them a taste of Army chapel life. One sweet piece of that was my older son Cameron graduated from high school while we were there, and he wanted to make sure that some of the, you know, retired senior citizens from the chapel could come to his high school graduation, because he was that close with them. He saw them more as friends than anything else. So that was Harold Smalls was one of the folks there. And then the other one there that was interesting, that was during the time of doing away with the whole Defense of Marriage Act, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and those kinds of issues. And it turned out, although somewhat while I was there and somewhat afterwards, that my ratings chain consisted of 2 lesbian officers. But they were very professional. It wasn't a big deal. For me, as a you know, fairly conservative Christian chaplain, I'm seeing those actions as sinful, but at least in that context, it was a professional working relationship. So, you know, we got along, and that was good to see. That was encouraging in one sense on the U.S. Army side that could work itself out. So that was just a curious, interesting thing. But probably my favorite assignment is the one that I'm in right now, because it runs. I get to work with you know, senior active component chaplains here in the Pacific, and network with them for training or reserve questions. But also I'm mentoring battalion chaplains, so I get kind of a nice breadth of issues to deal with, and I've got a great team here right now. Chaplain Peter Strong, Sergeant First Class Justin Philistine, and our contractor, Miss Jackie Carney. I've been in this position almost 4 years now, and in the 4 years I've kind of always walked with a limp as far as staffing goes. We had an NCO who failure to obey orders, fraternization, encouraging underage drinking. We had to, UCMJ Article 15 her. Another officer, his English writing skills were so poor, I had to rewrite everything that he did staff work-wise. So I was kind of walking with a limp for a while. But now I feel like I'm firing on all cylinders. It's very satisfying.
Shifting gears a little bit. Well, before we shift gears, anything of your journey, your story that we didn't touch on? That you...
Well, one little story of how God how God directed me to the AGR chaplaincy. When I was leaving the regular Army back in '92, again, we were, as a family, very involved in the chapel. I was in the choir. My wife was the pianist for the service and also directed the choir. So we were very integrated into the Protestant chapel service there in Fulda, Germany. And the chaplains had a little commissioning service for us as we were leaving because they knew I was going to seminary. One of them had told me earlier, when I was told him I was going to go to seminary and thinking maybe of being a chaplain, he said, "Well, I was wondering what took you so long." It was Chaplain Marty Mathis, who I later ran into at the chaplain school. And another chaplain, Ed All, I think was his name, he read a passage from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, God's call to Abram, as part of that little commissioning. And that reference stuck in my mind because I'd never had somebody kind of say, this passage is for you specifically at this time. So fast forward to 2002, fast forward 10 years, and Andrea had said she'd go, but still emotionally it was very difficult for her to conceive of leaving Illinois and going Oconus to Hawaii. You know, her parents' health was always up and down, and visiting friends. You could at least, if you were Conus, you could at least drive there. Here, you can't do that. So she was struggling with that. And one day, I think she was out grocery shopping or something. I was home, and I was praying about this, and she had just made some comments to that effect. And God brought the reference to mind. I couldn't remember what the text said. So as I looked it up, it kind of hit me right between the eyes. Because if you remember, my father, we bought the house next door to my parents. During those 7 years, my grandmother moved in with my parents and passed away. 2 years later, my mother passed away. So my father is living in the house next door alone. And this is really my home church. This is '92, and I'd been a member there since '79. And, excuse me, this is no longer '92. This is 2002, and I'd been a member there since '79. So it was really home, if any place was, at the time. And at the moment I was praying, I didn't yet know I was coming here to Hawaii. I just knew that there were options. It was going to be Massachusetts, Hawaii, or Puerto Rico. All very different from Illinois, and some very far away. So, as I opened the passage, it said, and God said to Abram, "Leave your father's house and your country, and go to the land that I will show you. And I'll, make you a blessing to the peoples there, the families there." And that's exactly what I was having to do. Now, I don't think that passage was written there specifically for me, but God had called Abram to do these kinds of things. And so God could call us today to do similar kinds of things. And he would go with us and use us to bring a blessing to others. So that, I told that to Andrea when she got home from shopping, and we were very much at peace with the decision there moving forward. I'm about just over 2 years out from retiring now, and I'm kind of curious as to what the next chapter is for us. Don't have any kind of directions yet, but we still have a couple years. But part of me is very eager to see, because this has been a very satisfying ministry time period. Yeah, I'm eager to see what's next.
Speaking about the future, focusing on the chaplain corps. So, starting with the positives, what do you see as in the next generation? What's the greatest untapped potential or opportunities for the chaplain corps?
Potential. I see difficulties mostly. As the United States gets more secular and more apathetic towards Christianity and faith more generally, having a chaplain, being a chaplain, you're going to be more and more on the periphery of things. Leaders coming up, future leaders, won't have grown up, with church or chapel being a big part of their lives, so they'll maybe wonder even what to do with the chaplain. So chaplains will need to not abandon faith and religion, but have better skills in explaining the importance of faith and religion generally, and their specific faith, because they represent an endorser, and they need to be faithful to their faith. They need to have those skills. They can't just can't expect people to come. On the other hand, they can't set aside their faith and do something else. They're chaplains, and they represent their specific faith group, and they need to be a good representative of that faith group. If nothing else, to encourage others who, in their faith, to be faithful to it. Now, I'm an evangelical. I believe that there's a true faith and there are false faiths. But in our pluralistic country, as a staff officer, I'm here to ensure free exercise. But I want all chaplains to represent their faith well and not water it down with maybe psychology or an attempt at being neutral, almost neuterized, neutered, some kind of civic religion there's no generic God. So you can't have a generic faith. So I try to encourage my subordinate chaplains to be faithful to their faith, strongly so, and to represent their faith well. Most of them are Protestants. Got a couple Catholics, and I'm in the process of getting a Buddhist chaplain. But yeah, I want them to represent their faith well. And I think that'll be difficult. The temptation will be to find something else that is maybe helpful, but doesn't, as I would put it, doesn't make Jesus the hero.
Imagine that you were the chief of chaplains for a day.
Never
And,
happened.
and unlike reality, where every decision has to be staffed as part of a larger bureaucracy, your decisions will be executed perfectly, flawlessly, immediately. So you're the chief of chaplains today. What one thing would you change that would make a positive effect for our soldiers and families?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and I can't say I've put a lot of thought into that. It's a good question, but I haven't thought ahead of time of what that answer to that question would be, because I'm in the reserves. The chief is an active component position. I cannot be the chief of chaplains. Now, that's a whole other issue. I would love to see the chief of chaplains be selected from the 3 1-stars. And just make that a rotating multi-compo position. That's a dream. Maybe that's the change. But I think that our basic course isn't long enough. I think our chaplains need more time greening, and especially those coming from the civilian side of things, and more time assimilating the military culture and thinking through how they are going to represent their faith in the military. And it's a fire hose right now. 13 weeks, shorter than most other basic courses, and yet we're taking people with no commissioning background or training, no pre-commissioning training. Nobody's coming from, you're not having everybody come from a West Point or an ROTC or an OCS. You're getting people right off the street. 13 weeks, bam, you're in a unit. I think it needs to be longer. I really do, for the health of the chaplaincy. There are plenty of helpful organizations out there in my own command. My offices are near the Family Programs Office, near the Education Services Office, near the IG and EO offices. All those offices are trying to provide help to soldiers and family members. But when the Army thinks of cutting things, it always thinks of the last thing you're going to cut is the trigger puller. But there's so much these days supporting that trigger puller that the temptation gets to be to cut those just and take so much risk in family areas. I just see that from where I'm sitting now. I don't know if there's a way to get those kinds of things more firmly established. At least in my area, a lot of those positions are contracted out. So they're easily stopped. Might be nice to have some of these legacy things go away, but on the other hand, there's some risk there too. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yes. All right. Well, I appreciate you coming in and sitting down to talk and recording your experiences and thoughts on camera.
Well, I'm honored to be asked, and thank you for the time.
Thank you.